Some friendly, familiar faces, so welcome.
We're gonna wait for a few more people to just settle in from the waiting room.
For those that are waiting now, if you could just please write your name, your role. I know that you're all from the same agency, but just, kind of write in that information in the chat to welcome you today. Have Andrea from Glendale Elementary. Shannon, welcome. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Virtually.
Virtually, right? We have Peoria Unified School District, Glendale Elementary. Hi, Rochelle, welcome. You are from Tolson Union High School District at Copper Canyon High School. Welcome.
I'll go ahead and get started. Carrie, is there anybody? I'm assuming nobody else is waiting.
Correct. Yeah, no one else in the waiting room.
Okay, perfect. Suki, Angela, if you guys are okay with me starting. Okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. So again, welcome. Thank you all for being here. This is part 2 of 3 from our equity series. If you were here last month for the first one, it was very enriching, enlightening. It was wonderful. And so if this is your first time here, I'd like to again welcome you. It's going to be facilitated by National Training and Technical Assistance Center for Child, Youth, and Family Mental Health in partnership with Touchstone Health Services and our CARE Coalition. Again, we see some familiar faces who are involved with the CARE Coalition. So thank you for supporting and being here. I want to start off by saying that the views do not necessarily represent THS or HHS. My name is Karina Herrera, and I'm happy and excited to welcome Suki and Angela here today. They are going to be presenting on systems of care and school leadership. So again, I want to give a little background of how we started in case you were not here for part 1. And the background of this is based off of our CARE Coalition. We had information from our members on how throughout people joining, they kind of shared with us that in their communities, they were witnessing or even facing some adversities that they really wanted to bring to the forefront, talk about it. And not just in their communities, but just in the world in general. This past year had not only, the pandemic and social injustices, but it also brought a lot of mental health adversities that our community members really wanted to speak on and have a safe space to be able to talk about these uncomfortable conversations, tough conversations, and conversations that they could learn from. So we brought in some experts that are more than willing to talk about things such as the ones I mentioned. So today we have the systems of care approach, and Suki and Angela, if you guys want to take it away.
Thank you, Karina, and so excited to be here today with you all. As you mentioned, next slide. I'm Angela Castellanos, and I am a licensed clinical social worker here in California, actually. And I have served as a school-based social worker and also a school mental health administrator for over about 25 years and a lot of different, I think I would say 4 to 5 school districts in California, here in Southern California. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I specialize in implementing school-based mental health programs through trauma, suicide prevention, crisis response. And again, so excited to be here. I'm going to have Suki introduce herself as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Suki Steckel. I'm so excited to be here with you today. I am the Partnership for System Transformation team lead with the National TA Center that Karina mentioned. And I hope to be building on the conversations from the first series around equity today. I come to you from Nashville, Tennessee. I am on faculty with the University of Tennessee College of Social Work. Been here since 2015, and prior to that, I served as the Children's Mental Health Director for the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, and worked in a number of our systems of care across the state, both in local communities and statewide. And I also have been a TA consultant for the last 5 years and had the privilege of traveling to a number of different communities across the country and working with different program directors and administrators to implement the system of care approach. So we'll be spending a lot of time kind of widening the lens a little bit and talking about system level transformation.
Thank you. Next slide. Before we get started, we're going to talk a little bit about a disclaimer here. So as you can see here, the presentation was prepared for NTAC under the cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. And the opinions here are the views of the speakers and do not reflect SAMHSA or the Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. We're going to give you just a very short overview of NTAC and the support services that we provide. In the next slide, you can actually, this particular slide, you see all the different agencies that are part of the NTAC collaborative. And then the next slide, we go over some of the goals related to NTAC. You know, the focus is that all children, youth, young adults, and families with emotional or behavioral health needs can access evidence-based treatment in a well-coordinated system of care. This is who we serve. You know, we have all of the different types of stakeholders, including you here today. And then the next slide, we show all the different services that we provide. And at the end of the presentation, there is information about connecting for additional services related here in this particular wheel. In the today's session, we're going to take you through, the second part of the journey in relation to the conversations that you had in the first session. We're going to have a discussion about the adverse childhood experiences and social determinants of health, overview of system of care approach, and also the principles. What do they look like? And at the last component of it, it's going to summarize it really nicely to take this information with you and have you think about some of the ways that you're going to be utilizing this information back into your school sites. Before we get started, I'm going to transition it over to Suki so she can get us started.
All right, thank you so much, Angela. And before we get started, we were remiss to say that many of you all saw Yasmina Luxinger's name on the original agenda. She and I met at length yesterday, and we have been working on this presentation for quite a long time, many weeks. And unfortunately, she had a family emergency late last night and had to fly out of town to attend to those needs, as I'm sure all of you understand. And so I'm very sorry that Yasmina won't be able to join the conversation, but she's very much here in spirit and throughout all of these slides. So just wanted to mention that before we get started. There's no way to fill her shoes. If you know her, you know that that is not a possibility. So I'm not even going to try. But we are so excited that Angela could jump in and offer some excellent school-based perspective as we kind of move through the conversation. So before we get started, I wanted to invite all of you to think about the information that we're going to talk about, especially because it's going to be, big, systems level work. We're going to talk about programs. We're going to talk about policies and practices. But at the end of the day, it's always about the children and young people that we're serving and that we're working with and that we're educating. So I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that the reason we get out of bed in the morning, pretty much for all of us, is because we're trying to improve the lives of the young people that we work with. And so I invite each of you to center a specific child or young person in your school or in your community that you can think about and truly dedicate your learning today to that person. And I invite you to just sit quietly and visualize that person's face. Think about their spirit, think about their energy, think about working with them and what that feels like to you. And we're just going to have a moment of silence for about a minute to just kind of get grounded before we get started today and thinking about the ultimate goal of why we're all here. Thank you all for that. So we are going to continue this conversation on a topic that may be pretty familiar to all of you. But before I jump into delving into this slide a little bit, I wanted to invite Carrie to put in to launch a poll. And I wanted to check in with each of you about your familiarity with ACEs, with adverse childhood experiences, that typical study that came out, the Kaiser Permanente study that came out in 1998, and just talk about your familiarity with that and just where this lands for you when I just say the word ACEs or the acronym, adverse childhood experiences. I'll just give you all a second to view that poll. Okay, so it looks like the vast majority of you all are really familiar with this. So that's really good. Yes, Susan said she's very aware. So I appreciate that. I think that helps us to not spend as much time on the tree portion of this. So feel free to raise your hand or drop in the chat if you've seen this slide before. This is a little bit newer from ACEs Connection. And if you're in the ACEs realm, this might be, yes, this is old news, Suki, or this might be new to you. But I really love, I love thinking and talking about ACEs. I bring ACEs into my MSSW curriculum here at the college and have for a long, long time. And anytime there's a new development, I love talking about it. And I think the brief for today, this is a really good place to kind of ground us as we start to think about equity at the systems level. So you all know about ACEs. I'm not going to regurgitate that for you, but I do think it's important to think about where do those ACEs come from. So you can see here the tree here represents those kind of household dysfunction ACEs that you all are really familiar with: physical and emotional neglect, maternal depression, domestic violence, separation from a caregiver, our incarcerated family member, parental mental illness, parental drug and alcohol use. And so where do these things come from? And when we kind of widen that lens a little bit, we can start to think about these individual level factors or family level factors. They don't happen in isolation, as we all know. They happen as part of a constellation and at the intersection of many, many, many different factors that are really born out of the community and neighborhood and even in the geographic area in which all those people live. And so there are things that really form the soil from which a lot of that pain and trauma and toxic stress emerges and grows from. Everything from substandard schools to structural racism, historical trauma, poor housing quality and affordability, poverty. You know, poverty was not one of those original ACE questions on that original study, but we know the relationship between poverty and stress is absolutely critical to understand. So there's so many community level factors, you know, violence in the neighborhood, lack of social capital and mobility. I mean, that has huge impacts, especially for kind of future trajectory of a child's life and how they're able to kind of go on to further education and other business opportunities and career opportunities. So what are those factors that are important in your specific community? We're going to talk about, and I'll invite you to consider. And the third factor that sometimes we don't all talk about, but boy, have we been talking about that a lot over the last year and in the first series, is we talked about these environmental factors. What is happening in your specific community related to racial justice efforts? What's happening with police brutality? What's happening with environmental conditions like wildfires or droughts? The pandemic has impacted all of us in different ways. And one of the important pieces about the environmental aspects, and some of this is related to the community aspects as well, but especially these environmental factors, is that while they may be so big, like a natural disaster, for example, like a tornado, they're going to impact entire neighborhoods, communities, even states, but they're not going to impact people equally. I can just give you Nashville as a good example here in Tennessee in the Southeast. Just in the last year alone, environmentally, we experienced some of the most devastating tornadoes our state has ever experienced just right at the beginning of the pandemic. It was tornadoes, then the pandemic, and then, and we're still recovering from those tornadoes. And then over Christmas, you all probably know we had the Christmas Day bombing right in our beautiful downtown that is an economic center of our, and not just our city, but our entire state. And then here at the end of March of 2021, in several pockets of Nashville and Middle Tennessee, we faced devastating floods. And I myself was a victim of that flood, and I lost my house and my car in that flood. And just as a personal example, you know, that was horrible. And I lost my home, but I did not lose my livelihood because I had my work computer, sadly, because I took it on vacation. But I had my work computer, so I could just go somewhere else and plug in and move on with my life. But my very next door neighbors, who were just a few feet away, that's not their business was different. Their business was not run on computers. They had very expensive like video equipment, and they lost all of it, and they had no hope of recovering it because of a series of factors. And so that's two houses right next to each other that are, you know, basically exactly the same, experience the exact same flood, but the impact of that is completely different. And that flood, that environmental disaster, is happening within the context of these larger environmental factors and these larger community factors like poverty and food scarcity and poor water and things like that. So there's so much intersection happening with all of these. And I think it's really important when you're talking about how do you address equity through your practices? How do you address equity through your policies? And how do you set up your infrastructure in your systems so that you're addressing equity? This is one of the things that I invite you to consider first and foremost, is that there are things that are happening all the time, but they're impacting people in different ways. So how do you kind of level the playing field in terms of access to services? How do you level the playing field in terms of being able to provide individualized care to address these issues that impact children and families in different ways? So we are going to do, for about 6 minutes, we're going to break you all up into breakout groups. And there'll be groups of 3, and I invite you to each talk for 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a little report out so we can learn from each other, have a learning moment. And so when you are in these breakouts, I would like for you all to think about what are the top 2 factors from each of these 3 levels that are biggest priority in your community. And that can be your school community, that can be your larger coalition community, however you choose to define it. And then I want you to identify one thing, either at each level or just one thing in general, that is impacting your school or community that's not on this list, but kind of fits under kind of household issues, individual factors, community, or environment. So exactly, thank you, Carrie. So pick 2 of the most pressing concerns from each level impacting your community today, and identify 1 factor that you feel like is missing from here. So we'll go ahead and drop into those breakouts, and you'll get a 2-minute warning that you'll have 2 minutes to kind of finish up your chat, and we'll come back and discuss it as a group. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a helpful exercise, and I would love to hear a little bit about what you all learned and what you shared, and you know, what was similar and what was different in your individual groups. So feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and share that, or you can drop information in the chat.
On ours, we had poverty, we had bullying, and that was based on the community level. There was also like homelessness. I know someone mentioned that in our group, and then I was talking a lot about like that instability and not, you know, from having to be virtual, then back in school, then hybrid, then just virtual, then no, just back to school. So, you know, that can cause a lot of like feeling that there's no trust there, or, you know, just that like no sense of security.
Or consistency, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Karina. Who else would like to share?
I can share. I was in one of the breakout sessions, and some of the pieces that were mentioned were, one was the generational mental health that impacts students. And then we also talked about how we really love the comment that you made about how it impacts everybody differently. Access to services. You know, we had a conversation about just like in the beginning of the pandemic, like some students couldn't even get a laptop or a device, right? Or they were sharing, one family was sharing one device or one hotspot. We also talked about homelessness as well.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and I think to add with Angela, I think we talked about parent mental health concerns, but from like the school perspective, seeing a lot of teachers and social work, you know, the burnout, the stress and mental health toll it took on those that provide care at a school too, and how that, you know, the mirror neurons, right, and how those kids pick up on that too. Just that pandemic level, that widespread impact that it had.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Erica. Did the other groups come up with similar things? Oh yeah, you said parental stress, mental health concerns. Any other thoughts about that? What was missing? What was missing from this graphic?
One of the big ones that we discussed was the impact of the pandemic on the adults supporting the students. Just the wellness. We talked about an increase in teachers needing support, or, you know, can benefit from support. We talked about a large school district here in Southern California that actually opened up a crisis number for teachers, and they've seen an increase in like risk assessments. So that's missing there. That's what we thought was missing.
Mm. So it's kind of a combination of
Mhm.
environmental with community and individual. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And how many of those teachers have their own families? So you have pandemic stress at work, how you're, and it wasn't that weird how it was, I don't know if weird is the right word, but it just seemed like teachers were heroes. And then it was like somehow that shifted.
Mhm.
And now I'm seeing where teachers are being talked about not in that same light. And what does that do? And especially
Mhm.
after a year of all of this. And also that's really different depending on where you are geographically. And I know you all are in the same place, but it doesn't look the same,
Mhm.
across
Mhm.
jurisdictions with that too. So that's good. That's a really good one. And I think it brings to light how sensitive and how responsive we need to be as folks who are actually designing policies and designing programs. And sometimes you just get hit over the
Mhm.
head with something like a pandemic that you are completely not prepared for. And everybody has to, that trendy word pivot, everybody has to pivot
Yeah.
all of a sudden, and figure out what to do in really stressful situations. And so one of the things I encourage you all to think about as we move through is what would have been the results of all those things. Like if you think about the number of teachers that are increasing those calls to that crisis
Mhm.
line and needing those assessments and how stressed they are at home. So we're thinking about supporting our teachers. What needed to have been in place prior to the pandemic so that it could have been a smoother ride? And I know that's such a shoulda, woulda, coulda. I know that's such a hard
Mhm.
question, but as we move through this, those are the kinds of things I think it can be helpful to think about, especially because at this point, I think things are feeling like it's not a matter of, if there's going to be another pandemic or global stressor or crisis or what. I just listed 3 just in Nashville in the last year.
Mhm.
It's a matter of when. So how are we working to set up structures that are in place, for the next time? And how can we use this as an opportunity to identify lessons learned so that we can address things in a better way moving forward and be able to anticipate them, right? I mean,
Mhm.
did we really think we were going to get to a point where we needed to talk about risk assessment with teachers? We talk about burnout, sure, but to that level. So, how do we think about these things moving forward? And same with us, same with teachers. So, thank you for all of that. So there's lots to think about, and there's lots of kind of themes and factors that I heard from you all that I've seen in other areas, of course, but that I also see as being, somewhat unique to where you are, at least in terms of the combination of things. And so I'd like to shift our conversation to talking about achieving equity through systems of care. And then we'll kind of get into some conversation about, what even is a system of care? What are we even talking about there? So the system of care approach, which I'll sort of define a little bit more in a second, but I thought it'd be really helpful to think about all the issues that you all just talked about with parental stress, with things happening at schools, things happening in the community and kind of system level, and thinking about those adverse childhood and community experiences. And thinking about, how can we disrupt some of these social determinants of health? So we're talking about basically fertilizing that soil in a better way. How are we working to mitigate some of those community and environmental factors so that our individuals and our families, our kids are able to succeed and do better, and to prevent some of these chronic health conditions like mental health issues that we're talking about today, and I know many of you all are involved in. And one of the things that the system of care approach from the federal level has been doing for the last several decades is they've been studying this. They've been researching and evaluating implementation of the system of care approach across states, tribes, and communities. So the next 2 slides is actually national level data from many years of these studies. And so the first thing out of the gate that systems of care, that the implementation of the system of care approach in communities has been found to help is to help youth and young adults improve things like school attendance and grades and the increased stability of living situations. And that housing instability and the homelessness that you all talked about, that's a major, that was something that you all brought. So I see a connection off the bat right here. It also has been found to help caregivers increase the capacity to navigate a child's needs and learn new skills to increase the ability to balance work and home. So we know we talked about parental stress and parental mental illness. What was that stress like for parents to all of a sudden become teachers and having to navigate Zoom and do things that they didn't have to do? Systems of care has been teaching and helping and supporting parents and caregivers to learn new skills around how to navigate the systems that a child is involved in. Oftentimes, you all know this, when kids are involved in multiple systems like child welfare and juvenile justice and having issues at school. I mean, how do you navigate that? I mean, how do you even learn the language? Each one of those systems has its own language. It can be so overwhelming. So systems of care has been doing that for a long time. It also helps systems offer individualized services, improves care coordination, which is some of that navigation piece we talked about, but at the system level, increase wellness, partnerships with youth and their caregivers, and increase the use of treatments that work. So we're using evidence-informed treatments. So on the flip side, systems of care have also been found to help in a way by decreasing some of the issues. So preventing or mitigating some things like we've found a decrease in behavioral and emotional problems, which we all know impact learning outcomes. We've seen a decrease in suicide rates and in substance use at the individual level. For caregivers and parents, we've seen a decrease of caregiver strain, which is massive. Caregiver strain is a key indicator that you all know can impact every day a child's life. And we also know through recent research that caregiver strain, when it is related to a parent taking care of a child with a chronic medical condition, which mental health issues, falls under that it actually can shorten their lives by as much as 7 years. So caregiver strain it's no joke. It's a level of stress that's at the medical acuity level. And so making sure that we're finding ways to support caregivers is paramount if we want to support our kids. So for systems, we've seen systems of care approach decrease barriers and access to care, which is one of the things I already heard you all talk about. It has also decreased the reliance on these kind of cookie cutter sort of one size fits all approaches to addressing a child's needs. And it has decreased arrest and involvement with juvenile justice systems and decrease in school disciplinary actions. So these all sound like they're important issues. And underneath all of these, there are elements of equity when we're talking about access to care. So who gets access? What type of care is provided? Who is involved in planning those, planning and the system design level piece? Who are making these decisions to find out, who's really, basically who are we going to help? We can't help everybody, or how are we allocating these resources? So there's equity all throughout each of these levels. So jumping into talking about what the system of care approach is, and I know that from some planning conversations, I know that you all may, and systems of care is kind of funny because it's a pronoun in its own right. It's an approach. It's something specific, and we'll talk about that kind of specific nature right now. But it's also lowercase systems of care. We talk about like, how do we provide care in a systemic way? So we're going to kind of touch on both of those today. So we, as I mentioned, this approach from the federal level has been around, and there's a very long history. That's a whole other presentation that I will not do today. But just suffice it to say that the system of care approach was born out of the family movement and really emerged in the 1980s. We had our first family-driven and a children's mental health system reform organization here in Tennessee was formed by Tipper Gore, for example, in like 1985. So it's been around a minute, and we've been studying it for a long time. And the reason that it emerged in the child welfare system was because, or child mental health system, was because it was a response to very well documented problems in serving children with social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. And really serious mental health conditions and their caregivers. You basically had two options of care. You had like a 60-minute session, or you had, residential treatment, and there was just really nothing in between, and care really couldn't be individualized in the way that it needed to do that. And there was very little coordination across systems. So kids and families were falling through the cracks left and right. So the technical definition of a system of care is a spectrum of effective community-based services and supports for children and youth with or at risk of behavioral health or other challenges in their families, that is organized into a coordinated network, builds meaningful partnerships with families and youth, and addresses their cultural and linguistic needs in order to help them to function better at home, in school, in community, and throughout life. So that's a big old mouthful. And what does that even mean? And so rather than putting that definition up here, I offer this graphic to you to think about. The system of care approach is, it's first and foremost a philosophy. And that philosophy is values-based. It's based on a set of values and principles, and it undergirds the infrastructure that your systems are operating in. And when I say systems, I mean all of them. So I mean your community level organizations, your state organizations, your state kind of mental health authorities, education authorities, your local education authorities, your child welfare system, your juvenile justice system. So it's any touch point, any system that has some type of touch point with a child or family. That's really who we're talking about when we're talking about who needs to be involved in the system of care approach. And that philosophy supports that infrastructure, which then further supports the direct services and supports that directly touch that child or family. So that's really what we're thinking. We're thinking really big at the systems level, values and principles, that supports a concrete infrastructure through policy and practice that then supports those direct services. So a little bit about what the SOC approach is. The SOC approach is another way to think about that very wordy definition, is that it's an organizational framework for system reform. So we're talking about how our systems best serving our kids. And I wanted to pause here as we're thinking about this information through the lens of equity. I just wanted to acknowledge that our systems, when I say things like the juvenile justice system, or even the educational system, the child welfare system, these systems have harmed kids. They have harmed families. And there can be a chronic level of distrust that our families have for these systems that are, intended to help people. And so one of the things that I think as people who are involved in system level work is that we really need to take a step back and acknowledge that and think about how, if you, and also if we use kind of a trauma lens, in trauma work, we kind of think about relational injury really requires relational healing. And so if we acknowledge that our systems are responsible for really harming kids in some ways, or families are really setting up major barriers that have all these unintended consequences, then why would people trust those systems? So when we're thinking about systems reform, I think it's important to think about how are we using those systems to help heal? How can we use an interaction for a system so that it can be transformational for a family or for a child rather than just transactional? So what are we doing when we're actually asking those kids and those families to engage with our systems? And so when we think about this organizational framework, or think about the system of care approach as an approach for systems reform, that's a really important piece. How are we going to achieve equity if we don't first acknowledge that? So as I mentioned, it's a values-based system it's a value-based for systems and services. It's a guide to implement in a way that fits each state or community. It's also adaptable, which is really key. So it can be flexibly applied. You can use it as a flexible strategy for innovation, which is really important. And it's really critical that we apply it appropriately across different ages and stages. So different developmental ages, like in early childhood, in that kind of transitional period between adolescence and young adulthood. How are we helping kids transition from preschool to, kindergarten and first grade, and different levels of need? And you all know this through your, PBIS work or other kind of educational reform efforts, is how are we addressing serious conditions versus, preventing, maybe something that might, become more serious if we don't address it now. So really all of this taken together, this is why we're talking about it as an approach. The other thing is that systems of care is not an exact model. It is not a cookie cutter approach. It is not a manualized evidence-based treatment that can be, replicated exactly the same way in every area. So it's also not a single program, but it really is a coordinated network of services across different agencies. And that coordination piece is really key, and we'll dive a little more deeply into that in a minute. And as I mentioned, it's not a treatment or a clinical intervention that directly improves child and family outcomes without those accompanying practice level changes. So when we think about it, when you think about the system of care approach, I want you to think about this equation. It's really about system change plus practice level change equals improved outcomes. So kind of going back to that, that hexagon at the very beginning, when we think about this infrastructure supporting those services and supports, we need to think about how can we use a values-based philosophy to reform our systems so that our practices can change in a way that are going to directly help and support our families. And we're going to see those improved outcomes, and we're going to address those issues around equity and adverse childhood experiences we talked about at the beginning of our time together. So a little bit about the values. I keep on talking about how SOC approach is a values-based approach. I want to talk about these values in context. I want to talk about how they are, they've been around a while. I talked about how we started the SOC approach really in the 80s. And so it's evolved over time. So we originated with this idea of the first value being communities-based. And this was really about serving kids with mental health needs in the least restrictive environment and wanting to keep them at home, at their home school, in their community. We also talked about being family-driven and youth-guided. So how are families and youth who are on the receiving end of our care, how are they helping to kind of guide and drive the care that we deliver? Where is their voice in all of this? It's kind of this, nothing about us without us mentality. And also we talked about cultural and linguistic competence. And one of the things with that that's critical is it's not just about language, like Spanish things are available or they're available in different languages, but also what are the reading level that are you meeting people on? How are you addressing ethnic cultures? How are you addressing family culture in this? How are you using things? How are you approaching families from a strengths-based perspective? And one of the things that's so critical with this in terms of our evolution around these values is we know that it is a unreasonable expectation. No one can be competent in another person's culture. That's not ever going to happen. And so that has needed to and has evolved over time. So where we are now, the way that we talk about these values, and again, remember, these could be flexibly applied to your own communities and your own schools, is when we think about serving children and families with mental health needs, that community-based piece becomes really important around thinking about it being kind of community-driven. So it's really that community, and again, that goes back to your school community or your neighborhood community, that you're thinking about how are we making the determination of what do we need in our area? That may not, or zip code, a lot of folks focus on zip codes. Where do we need to, what does this need to look like here? It may not need to look exactly that way over here. And the family-driven piece is really important. And it's also evolved into being young adult driven as well. Young adults and young people and adolescents, they really know what works for them. They don't always know everything, even sometimes they think they do, but they really can speak on their own behalf and can be their own best advocates. They also can be fierce and fearless leaders, and developing student leaders, adolescent leaders, young adult leaders to help advocate for systems change and systems reform is really, really important. And so we can maintain that family-driven posture and evolve that into young adult-driven value as well. We also have shifted to be more trauma-informed and more culturally sensitive, culturally relevant, thinking about equity and how are our services and supports available in an equitable manner, in a developmentally appropriate manner, and how are they anti-racist? Like, how are we addressing these issues in a way that we can actually achieve equity in our community? And what does that even look like? We know that that's not going to look the same way in every single community. So these values are really what drive the SOC approach. And so one thing I wanted to ask you all, and feel free to put some of your thoughts in the chat or just unmute yourself, is how does this look like in your community? What does this look like in your community now? So I've talked a lot about an SOC approach also being, we're focused on practices. So yes, it's like systems and infrastructure, but ultimately it's about practices. So what does that engagement with that young person look like? What does that engagement look like in the classroom? What does it, how does it actually translate? And so I'm curious if you are kind of, when you're thinking about your sector and your community and your current approach to care or services or education, do you approach it now in this way? Like, do you think it's individualized and coordinated? Do you think your services and supports are family and young adult driven? And do you think they're culturally relevant and trauma informed? So if we think about values as being verbs, these are really action that we're really trying to get to. We're not trying to just paint something in the sky and hope that we get there. We have to practice it every single day. So what are some thoughts about where you think you are now with this in your community?
For us in Glendale, I believe for some of our tier 2 and students who are in tier 3 who need those extra supports, working with Touchstone and other behavioral health agencies, they are individualized and coordinated. And each school does their best. Can they improve? Yes, does their best to align supports and implementations to support each child. In regards to family and young adult driven, I don't think we're there yet. Our families need to build more trust with what's available in the community and become more knowledgeable. And we could do a better job in our district doing that. We have tried some approaches and we have some ideas coming for the upcoming school year. But perhaps once they build their knowledge and have the trust with those agencies, it'll grow in that area. And being trauma informed, having those services, we are working on that. We have a lot of improvement for there, but I believe we're on the right track, but we have a lot of growth to do.
Thank you, Andrea. That's really, really good to hear. And I think it's so important to acknowledge where you are, like you're doing, and where you think you need to go. And also part of the family and a young adult driven piece is to help them is for them to help you or us to help us figure it out, because we could think we're over here, but then if we really ask them, they could say, oh no, oh no, you think you're there, but you're really not. But we're never going to get to hear that voice if we don't change some of our practices and some of our approaches to kind of invite. It's not even just about, making our table longer so there's more seats at it. It's like, how are you even getting through the front door? How are you even finding your way to that table? And that takes a lot. There's a lot that has to happen in order for that to do. And if it was easy, everybody'd been doing it. It is very, very, very challenging, as it sounds like What are some other thoughts about where you are now?
Well, I was just thinking, you know, Andrea, just like with our prevention partnership with Glendale, I think we do try to do some of these, and we're, you know, it was just our first year, and it was in a pandemic, so we worked really hard together to make it happen. But you know, we started a youth leadership council with you know, some of the Glendale elementary 8th graders, and started to capture their voice. And then I'm a parent, and I think there was just so much stress. A lot of, especially Spanish speaking families, really gravitated towards the parenting classes we were offering and working on some skills for their home. So I do think like there's that start, you know, like that budding opportunity there that, you know, just a district that's been committed and working so hard, that I do see that, you know, we're going to be able to do wonderful things and support them. But yeah, I think that's it's hard, you know, and it's been a challenging year and I think it really kind of, just the impact of it, I think it really kind of challenged us all to think of what can we do more. You know, I think you said that earlier, like no one could have predicted what we went through and what would we have done differently. And now we know that I think there's gaps everywhere, right, that we need to address and start to fill. And so I think I know a lot of the people in this meeting are just driven towards that. And that's why they're here today. So that's promising.
Yeah. And I think with the pandemic too, it's like, what do we actually want to keep? You know, like I actually discovered some things that I did not know, you know, and I've seen, you know, different communities and agencies discover things, and especially like the whole working from home thing, or just all kinds of different supports that just, and I love how just telemedicine it happened. There was all these barriers, and then guess what? They really didn't exist. So, you know, I mean, there's a lot I think that we can keep too from, you know, this kind of relative collective trauma that, you know, has rocked our systems. Thank you all for that. So I wanted to shift quickly to the guiding principles. I am not going to talk about all of these, but I wanted to highlight a couple of them. And it sounds like they're ones that have landed for you as well, talking through all of this. And so I'm just going to go to the ones directly with the stars, but these principles they really go hand in hand with those values. So when you think about, you know, values or verbs, we can think about these principles as they translate into the practices. They help really kind of shape and define more of that infrastructure level that I talked about. So the values are that philosophy, and the principles start to kind of go a little into more detail with how are we actually, you know, providing individualized services. How are we making sure that families and youth are full partners at all levels of our system? So we're going to dive into that piece around families and youth. We're going to dive into some cross-system collaboration, sort of at the system level. How are we making? So we talk about things are coordinated, but what does that really look like? How do we do that? And I know that there's a lot of folks that are part of this coalition. So I'm interested how that part lands for you. We'll also touch just briefly on this idea of kind of incorporating or linking with behavioral health promotion, prevention, and early intervention and identification services. So that's a big one. You know, I mean, you can't provide developmentally appropriate services or individualized services if you haven't linked to all of the different places and agencies and systems that can provide those, or that need to, or sometimes are legally mandated to. And lastly, we'll wrap up with talking about continuous accountability. And this one is key because it feeds directly into any conversation you want to have around equity. You can talk about equity all day long, but, you know, where's the brass tacks? You know, how are we holding ourselves accountable for that? How are we holding our systems accountable to that? And so that is a really, really important piece, and kind of underscores and needs to undergird everything that we do. So as I mentioned, we're going to dive into some principles and talk about how they kind of look in action. So first up to bat is what we talked about under principle number 4 with family and youth driven. So we're talking about this at every level. So how are we engaging caregivers and young adult voice at the service delivery level? How are we engaging it at the system and policy levels and states? I understand there's some pretty exciting legislation that has just passed in Arizona. So great opportunity to think about how are you all engaging young people and caregiver voice in the implementation of that legislation and in future revisions to that? And one of the key things I kind of alluded to a second ago is when we think about actually putting this into action, it requires a major, major paradigm shift in how people think, act, and relate to one another. We make all kinds of assumptions about young people and their capacity to lead, and their capacity to think, and their capacity to learn, and same with caregivers. And when we lead with those assumptions, we have to get out of our own way. And so there's a really serious paradigm shift that has to happen in our expectations. And one of the things that I have seen in communities that have been really successful with engaging young people is that they really have changed their entire approach. Like they have really sat down and had direct conversations and direct engagement with, what are we doing well? What are we not doing well? They have addressed that issue of, it's not about how much we're lengthening the table. It's about, we need to help support you and prepare you so that you're not intimidated when you get to the table and you actually know what to do. And we compensate you for your time because everybody else around that table is getting paid. How are we incentivizing that? And, how are we kind of training and coaching and mentoring our young people so that they're prepared and they can really leverage their own stories and oftentimes their own trauma and their own pain to inform changes that need to happen at the practice level and the system level. And the reason for that is because success increases when we fully engage young adults and caregivers. They are truly the experts. We are not. We think we're experts all day long. We have however many, letters behind our name that took us years and years and years. I'm in academia. We love those letters. And so we understand, like, we have a lot of expertise in certain areas, but parents are always experts in their own family's needs and so how do we as providers, how do we as mental health practitioners or teachers, like, how do we draw that out of the people that we're working with? How do we help? How do we set up structures that are going to support, like you all mentioned, that the trust piece, like, typically trust is earned. How do you actually earn it? You certainly can't presume it. It really has to be worked for. So this is a really challenging one, and it's one that pretty much every single community struggles with until they figure out what works for their community. So a couple of things to highlight here. So this is like thinking about, how would we put this principle into action or into practice? So when we're looking at families and young adults as full partners at the system and policy level, like when we're really thinking about that partnership, it looks like advocacy. I mean, part of that is, first and foremost, they're at the table. So part of that means that as the designers, as the leaders in that, so as school administrators, as principals, as superintendents, when we're making decisions, when we look around the room or we look around the virtual Zoom room, who's not there? Who's, if we haven't even invited them or haven't even opened the door, let alone supported them on the front end so they know what to do when they get there, that piece is really critical. They can participate in policy conversations. They can participate in the design and implementation of services and supports. Young adults can provide peer support services. Are youth peer support services available in your community? It can happen, and it can be a Medicaid covered service, just like kind of the typical peer support services. How are they involved in evaluating? I have seen youth and parents be on evaluation teams before. So they're actually the ones interviewing or participating in focus groups or interviewing other caregivers on, what did you like about your service? I've seen it done. I've seen an entire play that young people design and wrote and produced themselves, where they were interpreting the data of around mental health. They called it the Data Dinner Theater. They had a red carpet and everything. And they talked about You know, what did this certain statistic around bullying in their school, like, how did that actually translate? And it was a better education than I can think, basically, than I can think of almost anything. It was extraordinary. And so, how are we providing opportunities for family and youth level leadership development? That has to happen. That's a practice that has to be supported at the system level. It has to be supported at the policy level, which because it involves funding allocations. It involves resources and time and energy and space. And so how are we creating the space for people to grow into these leadership roles if we want their voice really fully incorporated? They can train, youth can train other young people, families can, you know, caregivers can train other caregivers. And child and family partnerships can look like, so this is kind of, you know, what the system level has to do. Like, we have to change our approach. And so this is like on the child and family side, those partnerships can look like, you know, authentic supports for the caregiver unit. Respite is huge. Again, goes back to directly caregiver strain when we support them. Hotlines and helplines so they know where to call when needed. Helping caregivers and young people, you know, navigate care across systems. That's huge. That goes into that some of that skill building that we talked about. There's opportunities for caregivers and young people to gain those leadership and advocacy skills and connection to meaningful social and recreational activities. And depending on the community, there's also, you know, faith-based efforts and initiatives become really, really important when we're talking about social connections and social capital and community connections and being community driven. That can be a really important piece that, you know, is part of the system that sometimes we forgot. So moving on to thinking about kind of cross-system collaboration, this is a really big piece of the system of care approach. And when we are, kind of just summarize this slide, when we're all on the same page, when all of our systems are communicating and talking together and developing policies together and having kind of shared expectations, and we're sharing data and we're sharing resources, we can start to have conversations around systems reform that help us to do things like keep kids at home longer because we have individualized care available. So we don't have to send them to residential treatment. Or what often happens is kids get stuck in residential treatment because they don't have a step down service available in their community. And so then what is that doing? How is that building trust? How is that a transformational, experience rather than just a transactional experience? It's not. In fact, it's probably doing more harm. And so when you can have alternatives to residential treatment on the mental health side and the substance use side, you can keep kids at home and in school. On the child welfare side, we know that when you have things like therapeutic foster homes, or you have more supportive services for families, you can use those as an alternative to out-of-home care. When you can support those caregivers that are stressed and that are not handling things well, you can keep those kids out of the system. And anytime you're doing all of these alternatives, you can shift the way the resources in your system are allocated. And it means that when you essentially, the most expensive things like emergency rooms, inpatient treatment, residential treatment, it costs the most. So when you can reduce the number of young people that are engaging in those services because you have a more robust network of services in the community, you can save dollars, which then you can reinvest. And so education is a huge partner with that. When schools are connected to all of those different pieces, and because we all know this, you all know this is where kids are. So when they're just a major piece of the puzzle with this larger kind of children's mental health reform level piece, because they can help provide some of those cost savings if they are better connected to those mental health services, or those referral pathways are more defined, or they're sharing data. You can find ways to really essentially do a lot better on behalf of children and youth, oftentimes without spending or having to request additional dollars. It's simply the way things get shifted around when you're able to provide services and supports in the community. And so how we get there is really the key piece here is it's bi-directional, is that there is a role for state level work. I mean, we know that state level legislation in Arizona is about to have a huge impact. And so there is that state level piece, but then there's also the role of communities and schools and school systems and mental health systems. They are a huge part of this right-hand column in the communities. And so a couple of things I wanted to highlight is in that kind of state role, they're responsible for establishing consistent, statewide policies and standards. We all know everything is because there's some policy. They're responsible for passing legislation. But part of it is that, those state level folks have to be open to, and those relationships have to be present with community level folks, because they're the ones who are actually out there doing the work. You know this, you're seeing and engaging young people and families every single day. And so how are you translating that information that's happening at the local level, where you're doing things like testing and piloting and kind of exploring feasibility of new approaches, or you're just doing that regular, implementation and provision of services? How are you translating what is working and what is not working to that state level? What does that relationship look like today? So something to consider, because when the state is able to actually hear in real time what's going on and information is shared through things like interagency partnerships that have state representation and local representation across these different system partners, that's where change can really happen. But it doesn't happen if the right people aren't at the table and the right information isn't shared. And part of that is that local folks are really responsible for helping kind of train and develop, young adult leaders and parent leaders who can speak on behalf of themselves and on behalf of other, and advocate on behalf of other parents and young people, what it's really like. What is it like to not get your needs met? What is it like when something really works? So really the key here is that there is a system in place through things like interagency councils and partnerships. But all of that is part of that infrastructure that has to be in place for this bi-directional communication to take place, where it's kind of, community level up and state level down. You're really meeting in the middle to have these key conversations. So jumping to principle number 9, I'm not going to go over all of this. I just present this graphic to you as to think about, this is what's on the plate from the mental health side. So when you're thinking about coming from the education side, that is one piece when we're talking about addressing and preventing mental health needs in kids. That's the school system piece and that kind of referral pathway and how we're interacting with school-based behavioral health services. Like, that's one piece in this very big, very complicated puzzle that the entire children's mental health system is kind of attending to and having to deal with. There are so many home and community-based treatment services and supports that the mental health system needs. So when we're thinking about being able to provide individualized care, if we don't have this really long list of services available in our community, it's going to be really hard to provide that individualized care. And it's also going to be hard to provide that individualized care, even if all these services exist, if we're not coordinating across these different systems. And so the school-based piece is really, really important for helping a system understand, what is working and how are we addressing all of these issues, including out-of-home treatment supports. And the point is that rarely, and oftentimes it's probably not good for one provider in a community to be responsible in providing all of these services. Oftentimes you do provide, a community mental health center, it's going to provide, a spectrum of services. But how is that center coordinating with the schools? How is that center coordinating with other child welfare providers? How are they, coordinating with juvenile judges and the court system and things like that? Is mobile crisis available? Does it actually work? Is also a piece. So the key here is that we're incorporating and we're linking with all of these, but we are able to do it in a way that is reflective of the community's needs and that is in a language that people understand, that is and is delivered in an equitable manner, and that has youth and family voice kind of all woven throughout. So a really good example and opportunity for this is for you all to figure out, how are you going to implement this new Children's Behavioral Health Services Fund, legislation. And it's my understanding that you all are going to be talking about this as a community moving forward. And so I invite you all to think about, how can you use this new fund and this new legislation as a springboard for change that can ultimately support this. So when you're thinking about, requiring parents to complete a survey, how have parents been involved in developing that survey, for example? That would be system of care approach, being kind of values-based. Like, do parents understand it? Has it been pilot tested with parents? Is it collecting the information that you're going to have? Who's going to have access to that information? And thinking about, kind of falling through on referrals in a referral pathway. Where are those refers, where is that going? How many people are involved? Who is it linking to? Are those services available? So this is an opportunity to think about how to work across systems. And it's my understanding that there's a lot of people who are involved in this on your end, and you're going to learn more about it. And I think that we also sent out some links to some handouts and more information about this that you all can access. So lastly, I would love to check in with you all quickly. I think I'm going to stop share real quick. You all can go to menti.com and use this code. And so I want to ask you all to type in what accountability means to you. And I'm going to stop share real quick so we can put this up. I think Carrie put the link directly in the chat. Ownership. Transparency, good. Dedication, building trust, communication, yes. Realization, I would love to hear more about that. Taking responsibility, yes. If you feel comfortable, whoever put realization, can you share more about what you mean by that?
I put realization because sometimes whatever action you take, right? Sometimes you don't know that either it's hurting someone's feelings, or it didn't come across the way you thought it was coming across, or you just made a mistake, plain and simple. And someone's telling you like, hey, this is how it came across. This was my perspective. This is how you made an error. And I think it's a moment in time where you just sit back and reflect, and you realize, oh, I think I did mess up. And so then comes that ownership and that accountability to say, you know what, you're right. Like, that was my mistake, or I'm sorry that I did say that and it offended you, this, and then you explain yourself or whatever you have to do. You just take accountability, you take ownership. But in that moment, there's like a realization point where you reflect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I love that. And it's so true. Like, that's actually how it works, but there's a key piece there too with that accountability, is you have to be open to it, right? You have to be open to even hearing that information that you get. Well, thank you so much for participating in this word cloud. We're going to jump to just the very last slide. So kind of as a practice example regarding this principle, and I keep on talking about how this idea of continuous accountability is you know, it undergirds everything, you know, it's ever present. And this is an example of a community out of the state of Illinois in Kane County. So it's a county level initiative that is working on the system of care approach. And I just wanted to highlight that a lot of those things that you talked about with communication and transparency and responsibility, it is woven throughout how they are approaching their system. And they are using a, you know, kind of a no wrong door approach. So they're working across, you know, child welfare and juvenile justice and early childhood and mental health, all the different in education, all the different systems. And they are looking to share power with families to identify genuine needs as part of that communication. So what are we hearing? You know, do we create an opportunity for that? They're going to coordinate efforts among existing collaboratives across sectors. So again, that kind of coordination piece. They're enhancing their system of data collection and utilization, which is kind of goes directly to what you were just talking about with both transparency, but then also communication. So what information do they even have and how are they communicating it? And they're looking to address the root causes influencing children's mental health. It goes back to that soil and those environmental issues and those household dysfunction issues. And lastly, kind of going into this continuous accountability, is they're going to implement a robust quality assurance and improvement system. So how are they actually using this information, but then what is that information saying? So what does that outcome data say? What are, you know, are those disciplinary actions decreasing? Are those juvenile justice contacts decreasing? Are those behavioral health issues decreasing? Is school attendance increasing? So what's happening, but then how are they using that information to hold themselves accountable for those larger system goals that they're working towards? And ultimately, again, those improved mental health outcomes for children and families. So it is time to wrap up. I know I've had to talk quickly through much of this, but it's, you know, we talked about at the very beginning, and I invited you all to reflect on an individual person to dedicate your learning today. And so I think this is an opportunity to kind of come full circle when you're thinking about, well, what do you actually do with this information? And what are you going to do with that learning? And so there's a couple of questions to think about with a call to action that I invite you all to consider. And I think we can take just a quick minute to reflect on these. I'll go ahead and read them out loud to you, but you can kind of get your pen and paper or, you know, type on another screen or something. Your thoughts on how COVID-19 has changed our awareness of our systems of care. You know, what systems need to be present as we address COVID, who is not at the table. How might we leverage the momentum of emergency response collaboration to increase accountability and connection across our pathways of care? Another call to action question might be, how might we formalize connections and relationships across systems now so they are in place when the next crisis occurs? You know, how can we use our pandemic learning now to do a better job of knowing what types of supports we may need to have in place? What type of connections can we formalize so that we're better prepared next time something happens? And then also in line with kind of accountability and transparency and communication, what tracking and reporting mechanisms need to be in place so all partners have access to the same information and they can use that information to inform policy, practice, and funding allocation decisions. So you all will have a copy of this PowerPoint, and you will be able to share these call to action questions with your peers and your collaborators at your schools and your agencies. And so as we kind of think about closing up, are there any thoughts or questions that you all have related to all this information, or anything that's kind of jumping out at you as far as these questions that you'd like to consider? I'm just looking at the time and realizing that we don't have a lot of time for questions, so I'm going to wrap it up for us. Are there any general questions or anything else? Any other questions? I know we went through a lot of information today pretty quickly. So just looking at the time, it's 5:28 on mine, so it's 3:28 where you are. So I've enjoyed sharing all this information with you, and I really hope that this has been beneficial and that I've kind of challenged you all to think about equity in a new way and to expand kind of your view around systems and how we can work together and different values to think about. And so Carrie has posted a really quick Survey Monkey. So we'll send it out with a follow-up email as well. But if you want to go ahead and fill that out briefly, that would, I think it just takes a second. And feel free to send any questions to Carrie or anything else that kind of, as you all are kind of going down the road. I know you have a part 3 series coming up. So feel free as anything emerges to reach back out to us, and we can send you follow-up information or answer any questions that come up as you have time to kind of distill all this information. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Suki. It's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.